When the teacher called him a liar in front of the class, Malik felt his father die a second time. Except his father wasn't dead, and that was the problem. Because the man who tucked classified badges into a steel gray wallet every morning, the man whose voice clipped like a metronome when he said he worked at the Pentagon, the man who promised his son to speak the truth even when trembling, was suddenly turned into a fairy tale by a laugh that bounced off cinderblock walls and settled like dust on a boy's tongue. The room had the vanilla smell of dry erase cleaner, and the low murmur of seventh graders trying to sit still during career day. A carnival of poster boards and nervous parents and laminated dreams. And Malik had waited, heart-thudding, for his turn to speak. Because the question was so simple. What does your parent do? And he had said it with the careful pride of someone placing a glass bird on a windowsill. My dad works at the Pentagon, and before the syllables cooled, Mrs. Hensley smiled in that quick, superior way that told adults the joke was about to be someone smaller and said, Malik, we value honesty in this classroom. The laughter started unevenly, a few snickers from the back, then spread like rain across a windshield, and he watched his truth slide out of view while the teacher raised her palm to quiet them, and looked at him as if he had just claimed his father could fly to the moon after dinner. He felt heat climb his neck and settle behind his eyes, but he remembered his father's voice, the one that belonged to late-night phone calls and phrases like duty station and secure line, telling him that silence is a kind of armor. So he kept still, breathed through the ache, and stared at the map of the United States, tacked above the whiteboard where a blue pin marked Washington and seemed now like a cruel accessory in the room's jewelry of doubt. Mrs. Hensley didn't stop at the warning. She walked toward his desk with the click of low heels and the soft clink of the key lanyard that always reminded him of a jailer. And she said, Malik, we are talking about real jobs our real parents do, and we are telling the truth because lies make it hard for your classmates to trust you. And her voice was smooth for the adults who might listen and hard for the child who had to swallow it. And Malik thought of how his father's world used words like integrity and confirmed and verified. And how here, where the clocks were plastic and the windows stuck in summer, his own truth didn't count unless someone approved it with a stamp. He could have said more. He could have said his father had a rank and a name badge and meetings he couldn't talk about. Could have said the cafeteria lady smiled when his mother came in late for pickup, because everyone knew the Johnsons lived on a tight rope of schedules. Could have said the reason he was quiet was not attitude but caution, taught by a man who briefed other men on what not to say. But he understood the way a room decides who is allowed to be believed. And he understood that in this room he was a boy with brown skin and secondhand sneakers and a small voice, and the room had already done the math. He looked for help in the soft faces near him and found only confusion and entertainment. His best friend Aiden glued to his lunchbox with an I'm sorry tilt to his eyebrows. The girl 2 rows ahead covering her smile with a sleeve. The boy by the window whispering, Pentagon, like it was a punchline. And Malik's hands went cold around his pencil, the wood suddenly too smooth to grip. The black letters Pentagon repeating in his mind until they split into meaningless pieces. Pen, tag, on. While the clock over the door ticked like an irritated tongue. He knew his father would say, son, a lie needs your panic to live, and truth is patient, and he tried to be patient. But Mrs. Hensley wasn't done, because humiliation has momentum and adults sometimes confuse it with discipline. So she gestured to the front and said, class, let's all remember to be realistic today. And if anyone else feels like claiming a relative works at the White House or the CIA, let's save the creativity for art period. And that drew a clean laugh, the kind that brightens a teacher's afternoon. And it was then Malik understood that revenge didn't always look like fists or shouting. Sometimes it looked like a calm promise whispered into a sleeve. Remember this. The principal's voice cracked through the intercom with a prim urgency that did not match the room's mean amusement, and he said there would be a special guest in a few minutes. A security briefing for staff and students, please remain in your classrooms. And the announcement felt like a gust that lifted papers and opinions, because the adults glanced at one another and the students craned toward the door. And Mrs. Hensley smoothed her skirt and asked everyone to quiet down and pull out their career question sheets, which made Malik think about a form he had filled in at home where he had written his father's title in careful block letters, and his mother had nodded with a soft, proud hum without telling him not to. And he wondered now if pride was a candle that made you visible to people who enjoyed blowing it out. He placed the worksheet flat on the desk and steadied his breathing with the practice of a child who had survived nights of worry when the phone didn't ring and mornings of forced casual talk when it finally did. And he felt something turn inside him. Not anger exactly, but a sharpening, like the way his father whetted a knife and said a tool is only good if it can do its job. And Malik decided his job was to carry his truth across this room without dropping it, even if the floor was polished to make him slip. When the knock sounded, sharp and official, the class stilled and Malik did not let himself hope. He only listened as the door opened and a figure filled the threshold with a presence that made even the fluorescent lights hesitate. And while he could not yet see the face, he recognized the particular quiet that comes before consequences, the quiet that tastes like metal and relief, the quiet his father's boots brought into a room when the stakes were already on the table. And for the first time since the laugh, Malik allowed himself to imagine the look on the teacher's face when Truth walked in on 2 steady feet. When the door finally opened, the figure in the hallway wasn't Malik's father. It was the janitor pushing a cart stacked with paper towels and a bucket of disinfectant, his earbuds dangling, his presence unceremonious. The disappointment hit Malik so suddenly he felt it like a bruise. The class groaned, laughing again as the janitor muttered something about the announcement being for the next floor. Mrs. Hensley rolled her eyes at the interruption and, with a smile too bright, said, "All right, class. Let's get back on track." The tension broke. But for Malik, it didn't dissolve, it thickened. He watched the door close, the light flicker, and in that brief second of silence, he realized that sometimes the rescue never comes when you expect it, and the wound grows deeper in the waiting. That evening, the house felt smaller than usual, filled with the hum of a refrigerator and the ticking of the kitchen clock that seemed louder every time no one spoke. Malik's mother, Angela, stirred a pot of soup with a heavy hand, her eyes flicking toward her son every few seconds. "You're quiet," she said finally, but it wasn't a question, it was a confirmation. Malik shrugged, staring at the grain pattern on the table, the swirl that reminded him of a storm from above. "Just tired," he whispered. The lie felt strange in his mouth because it was the same kind of lie adults used to protect children, and now he was using it to protect them. The sound of a key in the door came sharp and metallic, followed by a low voice saying, "Evening." Colonel David Johnson stepped into the house with his usual precision, every movement efficient, no wasted breath. He was tall, fit, shoulders squared like a man accustomed to rooms that expected him to command. His uniform jacket hung neatly over his arm, his ID clipped to the breast pocket, catching the kitchen light. Angela smiled faintly, setting the spoon down, but Malik didn't move. He wanted to speak, to tell his father what had happened, to describe the laughter, the disbelief, the way his chest had burned when the word liar echoed through the room. But instead, he just nodded and said, "Hey, Dad." David studied his son, eyes narrowing just slightly as if reading a classified file. "Tough day?" he asked. Malik hesitated, then forced a small grin. "Just school stuff." His father grunted in reply, a soldier's way of saying, "I hear you, but I'll wait until you're ready." The silence between them wasn't cold, it was military. Everything in that house was measured, disciplined, even the way love was given in fragments, precise and functional. Later, Malik lay in bed, the ceiling fan tracing lazy shadows across the walls. He thought of his teacher's face, the smirk, the laugh. He imagined his father standing in that classroom, his presence erasing every doubt, every sneer. But even in that fantasy, Malik wasn't sure whether his father would look proud or angry. Downstairs, Angela and David's voices carried softly through the vent. "He's been quiet again," she said. "Something happened at school." David's reply was calm but heavy. "I'll talk to him tomorrow." Then papers rustled, the sound of classified reports being reviewed at the dinner table, as if the nation's secrets could coexist with a child's heartbreak. The next morning, Malik awoke to his father already gone. His chair at the table empty, but his mug still warm. A yellow post-it stuck to Malik's cereal box read, "Proud of you. Always tell the truth. Dad." Malik smiled, but it was the kind of smile that trembles before fading. At school, the whispers had already begun. Pentagon boy, Agent Junior, Mr. Make-Believe. Every hallway echoed with versions of the same joke. When he reached the classroom, Mrs. Hensley gave him the kind of polite nod reserved for children she'd written off as problems. During recess, Aiden tried to lighten the mood, kicking a pebble and saying, "Forget her, man, she doesn't know anything." Malik wanted to agree, but something in him had shifted. He no longer felt like a kid with a hurt pride. He felt like someone standing on the edge of something larger, a quiet storm preparing its shape. That night, while watching the evening news with his mother, he saw the Pentagon flash on the screen. Gray walls, flags fluttering, an anchor speaking about security reviews and upcoming inspections. His mother glanced at him, then at her phone. "Your dad might have to visit a few local schools next week," she said absently. Malik froze. "Schools?" She nodded. "Yeah, part of the safety program he mentioned. Why?" He didn't answer, but the corners of his mouth curled, not in joy, but in something colder, anticipation. Because now he could see how the world turns. Sometimes the truth takes the long road home, and sometimes that road runs straight through the classroom that mocked you. Meanwhile, miles away in a government office, David Johnson sat under fluorescent lights, scanning a folder marked Education Facility Safety Audit. His eyes moved down the list of assigned locations, and there, printed neatly beside Jefferson Middle School, was his next inspection date, Friday morning, 2 days from now. He tapped the page once, twice, then set it aside. A quiet unease coiled in his gut, but he couldn't yet name it. Back at home, Malik couldn't sleep. He replayed every word, every laugh, every glance until the memory hardened into resolve. He didn't want revenge, not exactly. He wanted acknowledgement, proof that truth could still command a room. Outside, thunder rolled distantly across the night sky, and he whispered into the dark, 2 more days. Somewhere deep down, he didn't know whether he was counting down to justice or to something far more dangerous. The teacher's past and pride, Mrs. Hensley, had spent most of her life mastering the art of control. Control over classrooms, over noise, over the quiet chaos that lived inside her own chest. The world knew her as composed, respectable, the kind of teacher who'd been honored twice for excellence in discipline and classroom leadership. But what no one saw was the other life, the quiet corners of memory she kept sealed behind her professional smile. The morning after Malik's humiliation, she stood before the bathroom mirror, her reflection lit by cold, fluorescent light, and for a flicker of a second she saw not the teacher, but the mother she used to be, the woman who had once believed in children's dreams before her own world came apart. She pressed her fingers against the sink until her knuckles whitened, whispering, "It was just a lesson," but the words didn't feel right. In the classroom, the day after the incident carried a strange chill. Students whispered Malik's name but looked away when he entered, their laughter replaced by a guilty curiosity. Mrs. Hensley told herself she'd handled it correctly, that boundaries mattered, that truth had to be enforced. But deep down, she could still hear the faint catch in Malik's voice when he said, "My dad works at the Pentagon." It had sounded so sure, so unguarded, like something sacred. She'd seen hundreds of kids spin stories to impress, fathers who were rock stars, athletes, CEOs, and she'd grown tired of pretending to believe them. Yet something about Malik's stillness afterward lingered in her mind, haunting in its quietness. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm tea, the television murmuring a local news segment about government safety inspections. The image of a tall, broad-shouldered officer speaking at a podium flashed across the screen, the caption reading, "Pentagon Security Division launches community outreach." His name appeared beneath, Colonel David Johnson. The name barely registered at first, a faint bell ringing somewhere in the back of her mind. She turned up the volume, watching the man's stern, intelligent eyes, the kind that could silence a room. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't place it. The thought came uninvited, Johnson like Malik Johnson. She scoffed aloud, dismissing it as coincidence, but unease crawled under her skin. The next morning, in the teacher's lounge, she overheard 2 colleagues whispering about the upcoming visit from some Pentagon representative. One said it was part of a district safety audit, another joked about extra security checks. "I heard he's visiting Jefferson Middle," the younger teacher said, flipping through a stack of memos. Mrs. Hensley felt a pulse quicken at her temple. She walked past them, pretending disinterest, but inside her mind, puzzle pieces began sliding toward each other. She reminded herself that plenty of people worked at the Pentagon, administrators, guards, clerks. It didn't have to be him. Yet the timing, the name, the haunting familiarity, it all hummed with possibility. That afternoon, during grading, she noticed Malik at the back of the classroom. He wasn't fidgeting or daydreaming like usual. He was calm, composed, too calm for a child recently humiliated. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. For a second, she felt something close to fear. There was no hostility in his stare, only patience, as if he knew something she didn't. That look stayed with her long after the bell rang, burrowing into the cracks of her conscience. At home, she dug through an old photo album, the kind that smelled faintly of dust and loss. Her son, Luke, smiled from the first few pages, 11 years old, gap-toothed, standing beside her at a science fair. The same age as Malik, the same quiet intelligence. Luke had grown into a stranger, a man she hadn't spoken to in years. He'd joined the military against her wishes, vanished into deployments, and every letter he sent reminded her of her own failures, how she'd pushed him to be perfect until he broke away. The guilt had turned her heart rigid, her classroom her battlefield, her control a weapon she mistook for love. She poured herself a glass of wine, the liquid trembling as she lifted it. Her laptop still glowed from the news site she'd left open. The article headline read, "Colonel David Johnson to lead Pentagon Youth Safety Initiative." The accompanying photo froze her breath. There he was, the same man from the news broadcast, standing beside the Secretary of Defense. She studied his features. The hard jawline, the upright posture, the watch on his wrist polished to military precision, and suddenly she remembered the photo pinned to the student profile sheet for parent contact, a small picture of Malik with his parents on family orientation day. She hadn't paid attention before, but now, recalling it, she could see it, the same jawline, the same steady eyes. It wasn't imagination, it was fact. The wine glass rattled against the table. A cold wave of dread passed through her. She had mocked the son of a Pentagon colonel, not just any officer, one high enough to appear on national news. Her stomach twisted. She tried to rationalize, to build her usual walls of logic. How was I supposed to know? He didn't look like... But she couldn't finish the thought. Didn't look like what? The answer made her flinch at herself. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every sound in the house made her jump, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the wooden floor, even the wind against the glass. Around midnight, she sat in her armchair and whispered to the dark, "It was just a misunderstanding." But another voice inside, smaller and older, whispered back, "It was cruelty and you knew it." At school the next day, her eyes followed Malik more closely than before. When he answered a question, she nodded a bit too quickly. When he handed in his worksheet, she murmured a thank you that surprised him. She felt like a woman walking on glass, each step careful, rehearsed. During lunch, the principal stopped by her classroom. "Big visit tomorrow," he said cheerfully. "Colonel David Johnson from the Pentagon will be here to talk about school security and character education. Impressive, right?" Mrs. Hensley managed a tight smile, her heart beat loud in her ears. "Yes," she said, voice trembling slightly. "Very impressive." As the principal left, she sat down at her desk, pressing both hands flat against the wood to steady herself. For the first time in years, she felt something she thought she'd forgotten. Fear. Not of reprimand, but of truth. Because she knew deep down that truth had a way of walking right into the room when you least expected it. And tomorrow, it was coming straight for her. The next morning dawned too still, the kind of morning that felt like the world had paused to take a breath before something irreversible. Malik woke early, his stomach buzzing with the electricity of quiet expectation. His mother had already left for work, and the house was filled with the faint smell of coffee and furniture polish. On the kitchen counter lay a folded note from his father, short and direct. Inspection today. Be respectful. I might stop by your school later. Proud of you. Dad. Malik read it twice, his fingers trembling slightly. He didn't know whether his father meant a casual visit or something official, but the words "might stop by your school" carried enough weight to make his pulse race. At Jefferson Middle, the hallways were unusually clean, the kind of cleanliness that signaled a coming event. Custodians had mopped before dawn, teachers had pinned flags and posters that read respect, integrity, safety. Mrs. Hensley moved through the building like a ghost trying to pretend it was still alive. Her usually sharp commands were replaced by soft reminders. Let's tidy our desks, eyes on your papers. But every word felt brittle, rehearsed. Her heart ticked in double time. At precisely 10:30, the front office announced over the intercom, "Please welcome our guest from the Pentagon, Colonel David Johnson." The sound of applause rippled through the corridors. Mrs. Hensley froze mid-sentence, the chalk in her hand snapping clean in two. For a moment she couldn't breathe. The students cheered, oblivious to the sudden pallor on her face. Malik sat motionless, staring at the door, his pulse roaring in his ears. Footsteps echoed down the hall, measured, firm, the kind that belonged to someone accustomed to command. The principal's voice carried first, bright and formal, "And this, Colonel, is our 7th grade wing." The door handle turned, and then he appeared. Colonel David Johnson filled the doorway like a verdict, tall, broad-shouldered, uniform pressed to perfection, medals gleaming faintly beneath the fluorescent light. His eyes swept the room with calm authority before softening slightly when they landed on Malik. He didn't smile, but his gaze held the kind of pride that didn't need words. Mrs. Hensley stood frozen beside the desk, her mouth slightly open. The color drained from her face as realization struck her like a blow. "Good morning, students," the principal said cheerfully. "Colonel Johnson is here to talk about the importance of truth, respect, and safety in our communities." He gestured toward the podium that had been set up near the whiteboard. "Colonel, the floor is yours." David stepped forward, his boots clicking softly against the tiles, each step deliberate. "Thank you, Principal." His voice was smooth but commanding, the kind that silenced chatter without raising volume. He began with a brief introduction about service, sacrifice, and the duty to protect. The students listened, wide-eyed, impressed by his presence. Mrs. Hensley tried to maintain composure, but her hands trembled against the desk. Sweat gathered under her collar. Then, as if by fate, David turned slightly toward the class and said, "Sometimes truth doesn't wear a name tag. Sometimes it's quiet, waiting for the right moment to be seen." He paused, eyes meeting Malik's. "My son reminded me of that this week." A murmur passed through the class like a current. Mrs. Hensley's knees almost buckled. She reached for the edge of the desk to steady herself, the room blurring at the edges. The principal, unaware of the private storm brewing between them, beamed proudly. "Students," he announced, "you might know Colonel Johnson's son, Malik Johnson, is right here in this very classroom." The silence that followed was absolute. Not even a breath dared to move. Every student turned to look at Malik, then at Mrs. Hensley, whose face had gone pale as paper. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Malik sat upright, calm, his dark eyes fixed on her. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply looked, and that look said everything. David continued, his tone even, almost gentle. "I teach my son that respect is not given, it's earned, and honesty, even when doubted, remains its own proof." His words carried a quiet gravity, one that pressed on the room like invisible weight. Sometimes people misjudge others because of what they think they see. But truth, he paused, eyes flicking briefly to Mrs. Hensley, always has a way of revealing itself. Mrs. Hensley's throat burned. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to undo what she'd done. But shame wrapped around her like barbed wire. The faces of her students blurred into one sea of astonishment. Malik's expression remained unreadable, but his stillness was louder than any accusation. The principal clapped. "Thank you, Colonel. That was powerful." David nodded once, then turned to Mrs. Hensley. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "thank you for teaching my son." The politeness in his tone stung worse than anger. She forced a smile that felt like a wound. When the bell rang, students spilled into the hallway, chattering with excitement. "Did you hear?" That's Malik's dad. He's real. Mrs. Hensley looked like she saw a ghost. The noise echoed long after they disappeared. Malik packed his notebook slowly, his hands steady now. For the first time in days, he felt no shame. Only stillness. Mrs. Hensley waited until the room was empty before she spoke. Malik. Her voice cracked. He stopped at the door but didn't turn. I didn't know, she whispered. I was wrong. The words were small, almost drowned by the hum of the lights. Malik didn't respond, but his pause was long enough to be an answer. Then he walked out, leaving her alone with the silence she had created. In the corridor, David was speaking with the principal when he saw his son. Their eyes met. A nod passed between them, father to son, soldier to soldier. No words, just recognition. But as they walked together toward the exit, neither noticed Mrs. Hensley standing by the classroom door, gripping the frame like a lifeline, her face streaked with quiet tears. Outside, clouds rolled heavy and dark over the schoolyard, the wind shifting like a warning. Malik looked up at the sky and saw it mirror the weight in his chest, an ending and a beginning tied in the same breath. As the father and son reached the parking lot, David's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, frowning. A single text flashed across, change of assignment. Immediate deployment classified. His jaw tightened. Malik saw it too. What's wrong, Dad? David hesitated, staring at the message for a moment before slipping the phone into his pocket. Nothing we can't handle, he said quietly. But the look in his eyes said otherwise. Behind them, through the glass doors, Mrs. Hensley watched them disappear down the steps, her reflection caught between their leaving and her regret. She whispered into the empty hallway. Sometimes truth comes dressed as forgiveness, but forgiveness, she would soon learn, has its own price, and it wasn't done collecting yet. The night after the visit, sleep refused to touch the Johnson household. The air itself seemed restless, shifting in small currents as if carrying unspoken thoughts from room to room. Malik sat on the edge of his bed, the faint glow from the streetlight sketching slow-moving shadows across the wall. Downstairs, he could hear his father pacing in the living room, measured, deliberate, the same rhythm Malik used to hear before his father left on deployment. That quiet repetition always meant change was coming. Angela sat curled on the couch, her eyes following David as he moved. They sent that message again? She asked, her voice soft but edged with dread. David stopped. The faint blue light from his phone glowed against his palm. Immediate reassignment, he said flatly. Overseas. For how long? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the ceiling as if searching for words between the beams. They're calling it short-term, but that word doesn't mean much anymore. A silence fell over them, thick and suffocating. Upstairs, Malik couldn't make out every word, but he didn't have to. He'd heard this tone before. The clipped professionalism of orders, the low tension of parting. He closed his eyes and listened, his throat tightening. When David finally climbed the stairs, his footsteps sounded heavier than usual, dragging a weight that wasn't physical. He stood in the doorway, still in uniform, his expression unreadable. Malik looked up, trying to find his father's eyes, but seeing only the shadow of duty there. Son, David said quietly. I'll be away for a while. Malik nodded, pretending it didn't hurt. Another mission? David smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Just work. They stood there in silence for a moment, two soldiers, one seasoned by war, one by disappointment, studying each other across the soft blue light. Finally, Malik said, She knows what she did was wrong. David tilted his head. Mrs. Hensley? Yes, she tried to talk to me today. Malik's voice was steady, but his eyes glimmered. I didn't say anything back. David stepped into the room, lowering himself to one knee. Sometimes silence teaches louder than words, he said. But forgiveness isn't weakness, son. It's strength that people rarely understand. Malik wanted to believe that, but the image of his teacher's smirk, the laughter, still played behind his eyelids like a film that refused to end. She didn't believe me, he whispered. Nobody did. David placed a hand on his shoulder. They will now. For a brief second, the soldier vanished, and the father surfaced, the man who'd carried his son on his shoulders at the Lincoln Memorial, who'd taught him to tie knots and read constellations. I'm proud of you, he said softly. You stood tall even when the world tried to shrink you. Never let anyone make you smaller than the truth. Malik swallowed hard. When will you be back? David's silence was the longest answer of all. At school the next morning, the world felt heavier, as if the storm from yesterday had left its residue behind. Mrs. Hensley arrived early, eyes swollen from a night of sleepless remorse. She'd written and rewritten an apology letter, each draft torn apart before the ink could dry. Every word felt inadequate. The guilt sat in her throat like gravel. When she looked in the mirror before leaving, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The professional mask was cracked, and the person behind it was raw and human. She walked through the halls with her head low. A few students whispered but didn't laugh this time. When Malik entered, she felt the air tighten. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. He didn't look at her, didn't need to. His calmness unnerved her. It wasn't defiance, it was power. Later that day, she went to the principal's office. "I owe that boy an apology," she said. "A real one." The principal raised an eyebrow, half smiling. "I'd say he's already had his justice, wouldn't you?" She shook her head. Justice isn't always enough. After school, she waited by the flagpole as the students poured out. The wind tugged at her hair and carried the sound of sneakers and laughter. Malik walked out last, his backpack heavy on one shoulder. When he saw her, he stopped, uncertain. "Malik," she said, her voice trembling, "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to hear that I was wrong. What I said that day, what I did that day, it wasn't about you. It was about me, my own bitterness, my own blindness." He stared at her, emotion flickering across his face like sunlight through leaves. "Why did you say it then?" Her voice cracked. "Because sometimes people forget what truth looks like when they stop believing in their own." For a long moment, the wind filled the silence between them. Then Malik said quietly, "My dad's leaving again." Her breath hitched. "When?" "Tomorrow." Tears pricked her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Malik, for everything." He nodded once, then turned to leave. But before he did, he said, "He forgives you already." She frowned, confused. "Your father?" He gave a faint smile. "No, truth does." He walked away then, leaving her with the kind of silence that heals and wounds at the same time. That night, the house was filled with the quiet rituals of departure. Boots polished, documents checked, the faint smell of starch and metal. Malik helped his father fold uniforms, each crease sharp, precise. Angela moved through the house like a ghost, pretending strength she didn't feel. When the time came, David knelt once more, gripping Malik's shoulders. "You remember what I told you, son? The world doesn't owe you fairness, but it can't take your truth unless you give it away." Malik nodded, his throat tight. "I won't." David smiled faintly, then straightened and hugged his wife one last time before stepping out into the night. The car waited at the curb, its headlights cutting through the mist. Malik watched from the doorway as his father climbed in and closed the door. The car rolled away slowly, swallowed by the dark, and for the first time since that terrible day in class, Malik understood that some battles aren't fought with fists or weapons, but with endurance, with truth, and with time. What he didn't know yet was that his father's departure wasn't the end of this story. It was the spark that would ignite everything that came. Next, the storm hadn't passed. It was only changing shape. The months that followed Colonel Johnson's departure unfolded. Like pages from a book Malik wasn't sure he wanted to read. Autumn came with gray skies and the kind of wind that makes you pull your jacket closer. Not because you're cold, but because you miss someone. The house felt emptier, though everything inside remained the same. The mug on the counter, the faint smell of aftershave that lingered in the hallway, the disciplined order of a man who believed every object should have a purpose. Each day Malik waited for a message, a call, a sign from his father. But the phone stayed silent except for brief official updates that told them nothing and meant even less. School had changed. The laughter that once followed him had vanished, replaced by cautious respect. Some classmates tried to be friendly again, but Malik stayed polite, distant. He wasn't angry anymore. Anger was too heavy to carry for long. But he had learned the weight of silence and how power could live quietly inside it. Mrs. Hensley, on the other hand, seemed smaller. Her once crisp tone softened into something fragile, almost hesitant. She listened more now, interrupted less, and sometimes when Malik spoke, she simply nodded as if memorizing his words. The students noticed the change too. Her room no longer felt like a place of judgment, but of recovery. By late November, a thin letter arrived, Pentagon stationery, folded neatly, addressed to Malik. He tore it open with trembling hands. Inside was a single page written in his father's blocky handwriting. "Son, I can't tell you where I am, but know that I'm safe." There are moments in a man's life when truth and danger look the same. And courage is simply not running from either. Remember what I taught you. Truth will outlast laughter, outlast lies, and even outlast me. Proud of you always, Dad. The words struck deep. Malik read the letter over and over until the ink began to blur under his thumb. He didn't know why, but something in that line, "outlast me," echoed with finality. 3 weeks later, the call came. His mother's hand shook as she answered, her face draining of color. The voice on the other end was formal, measured, the kind of tone that carried news no family wanted to hear. Malik only heard fragments: incident overseas, service recognized, classified circumstances. When she hung up, she didn't speak. She simply sat at the table, the phone still in her hand, as if words could break what silence had not. Malik's world folded inward. Time blurred. Neighbors brought flowers, casseroles, and soft condolences, each one like a new weight pressing down. At school, whispers followed him again, but not cruel ones. Gentle, pitying, the kind that come wrapped in sympathy he didn't want. Mrs. Hensley watched him every day, helpless, unsure how to approach the boy she'd once humiliated, and who now carried a grief too old for his age. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that she finally found her courage. She stopped him after class, her hands trembling slightly. "Malik," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I heard about your father. I'm so sorry." He nodded, eyes steady but distant. "Thank you. I wish there was something I could do," she said. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time, she saw no trace of resentment in his eyes, only weariness and a strange, quiet understanding. "You already are," he said softly. "You're listening." Something inside her cracked at that. She wanted to say more, to offer comfort, but the right words refused to come. Instead, she placed a hand gently over her heart and whispered, "He raised a strong son." That night, alone in her empty house, Mrs. Hensley opened her desk drawer and pulled out the old photo of her estranged son, Luke, the soldier she hadn't spoken to in years. She stared at his young face, realizing with a sting that the pain she saw in Malik was the same she had caused her own child. Without thinking, she reached for her phone, fingers trembling, and dialed the number she had memorized but never used. The voicemail tone sounded. Her voice broke as she spoke. "Luke, it's Mom. I know it's been a long time. I just wanted to say I was wrong. About everything. I'm proud of you. I hope you're safe." She ended the call, tears streaking her cheeks, and for the first time in decades, she felt something unclench inside her, a small, tentative peace. Weeks passed, and slowly the school began preparing for its annual Career and Character Day. The principal asked Malik if he wanted to speak this year, given his father's service. At first he refused. Then one morning, while rereading his father's letter, he decided to say yes, not for attention, not for pity, but because the truth deserved a voice. When the day arrived, the auditorium filled with students and teachers, their chatter soft but expectant. Mrs. Hensley sat near the front, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Malik stepped onto the stage wearing his father's old service pin on his jacket. His voice was calm but carried the strength of someone who had lived too much too soon. "My dad taught me that truth doesn't need defending," he began. "It just needs time. He told me that people will doubt you, mock you, even punish you for telling it. But if you hold on to it, truth becomes its own shield. My father worked at the Pentagon, but his real job wasn't about walls or secrets. It was about honor." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the lights. Malik's eyes drifted toward Mrs. Hensley. "And sometimes," he continued, "the people who hurt you the most are the ones who end up teaching you what forgiveness really means. Because forgiveness isn't letting someone off the hook, it's setting yourself free." When he finished, the entire auditorium stood. The applause rolled like thunder, but Malik's gaze stayed locked on Mrs. Hensley. She was crying openly now, her head bowed. Afterward, she approached him, her voice trembling. "Your father would be proud." Malik smiled faintly. "He already is." She nodded, and for the first time in her long career, she understood that teaching had never been about control. It had always been about humility, about learning from those you least expect. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and something softer, renewal. As Malik walked home under a sky brushed with light, He whispered the words from his father's letter one last time. Truth will outlast laughter, outlast lies, and even outlast me. And somewhere deep inside, he felt it. His father wasn't gone. He was everywhere. The truth still stood unbroken. Moral and closure. Life's deepest wounds are often carved by disbelief. But truth, steady, patient, and fearless, has the power to heal not just the one who holds it, but also the ones who once refused to see it. Forgiveness isn't the erasure of pain. It's the transformation of it into strength. And in that transformation, both the wounded and the mistaken find their redemption,